Han Li didn't have much time left. At most, he had another 4 to 5 months before he and Dr. Mo completely revealed their trump cards. Before then, he had no choice but to acquire skills to defend himself. As a result, he ultimately decided to only cultivate the simpler and easier mysterious techniques that could be used immediately. The more difficult ones would be put to the side temporarily. After he managed to escape the tiger's den, it would not be too late to resume practicing them. This would greatly cut down his cultivation time, enabling him to quickly and thoroughly master many of the simpler secret techniques. Han Li's mind understood. Even if he could completely master this secret technique, he wouldn't necessarily be Dr. Mo's match. If Dr. Mo hadn't been lying last time, his strength would be comparable to that of a region's illustrious overlord. Han Li did not know how many ferocious and vicious moves hadn't been exposed during their last counter. He feared that the skills that Dr. Mo had revealed was only a fraction of his true strength. As Han Li thought of Dr. Mo's monstrous agility, a burst of cold fear entered his mind. He was well aware that the time he had to learn was short and that any threat he could muster against Dr. Mo would be awfully marginal, almost negligible, but to have his hands tied and allow himself to be manipulated was something Han Li could not allow. Han Li knew that if he were to raise his hand against Dr. Mo, he would only have one decisive opportunity to seize a victory. Dr. Mo would most likely look down on him. Only by using Dr. Mo's carelessness and negligence against him would Han Li be able to catch him off guard and possibly obtain the opportunity to live. In the following days, Han Li finished memorizing all of the blinking sword art manuals. From the manuals, he selected the secret techniques that were the most useful to him. He began to research them, meditating on the cultivation paths that would yield the quickest results. He racked his brains for a few days. An entire set of cultivation methods from the manuals were laid out before him. Within this short time period, he was able to complete such a complicated task, making him feel pleased that his efficiency was extraordinary. During the second half of the month, Han Li handled a few trivial affairs, fully preparing himself by making sure that there was nothing left to worry about. First of all, he returned the secret manuals to Li Feiyu and took the opportunity to tell him about his encounter with the feral Wolfgang's spies as well as the real identity of the kitchen steward. After Li Feiyu heard this, he was pleasantly surprised. He embraced Han Li's shoulders and repeatedly said, "Good brother," for presenting him with such a great merit without taking any of the credit. This moved him greatly. However, he didn't know that Han Li's life was currently busy. How could Han Li possibly think about catching a spy? By telling Li Feiyu, Han Li wouldn't have to trouble himself with the matter and would also be currying favor from the senior disciple at little cost to himself. What would Han Li have against this? Once he finished his business with Li Feiyu, Han Li paid a visit to the sect's most skilled blacksmiths. He then placed orders for several daggers and secretly requested a few minor modifications. In addition, he ordered a few seemingly useless and obscure items, including several small exquisite iron bells. He also requested that all the items be forged with haste. As a result of his large purchase, Han Li had spent a considerable amount of silver, causing him to feel a slight heartache. Several days later, Han Li received his order from the blacksmiths. Seeing the shining daggers and small exquisite bells, he was very satisfied. He showered the blacksmith with praise, knowing that his silver was not spent in vain. That night, Han Li left his residence and disappeared without a trace. The only thing he left behind was a slip of paper on his bedside with the following words. Elder Mo. You need not worry, I did not run away and hide. I merely felt that being with you in the valley was far too stifling to cultivate the eternal spring arts. For this reason, I decided to find a different secluded location on this mountain and enter closed-door cultivation. Please be at ease. After 4 months, I will punctually return and meet with you. With respect. Han Li. Reading this out loud while sitting on his armchair, Dr. Mo grabbed the slip of paper in his left hand and quietly looked at it, his face still covered by dark clouds. On the side of the table, there was another note from the blacksmith, detailing Han Li's recent order. At this moment, Dr. Mo lightly tapped the desk with a finger from his right hand. Pu. No other sound echoed. Suddenly, he coldly snorted. The paper in his hand turned to fine ash and drifted into the air. He stood up unsteadily and paced around the room. Dr. Mo wrinkled his brow in contemplation. After pacing back and forth a few times, he stopped and said to himself, "Little bastard, although I don't know what sly plan you have in mind, you will not escape the palm of my hand regardless of what trick you play. I need you too much to allow that to happen." After he finished speaking, Dr. Mo suddenly turned around and walked to the window. A low and lengthy whistle left his mouth. Immediately after, a small and obscure yellow-feathered bird flew into the window. It flew several circles around the room before landing on his shoulder. A single small bird stood firm. It affectionately rubbed its beak against his face, letting out a melodious glee. "All right, I know you're hungry. Here, it's your favorite yellow chestnut pill." Upon seeing the bird, Dr. Mo's gloomy face revealed traces of a doting smile. From his pocket, he took out a yellow ball of bird feed and put it into the little bird's mouth. "Go. It will be like before. Follow that person diligently. If he leaves the mountain range, return to me immediately." Dr. Mo spoke to it as if he were talking to a person. Glee. After finishing its meal, the little bird let out an excited coo and flew around the room. After hearing his words, it left through the window and its figure faded away into the sky. Humph. Under the surveillance of the cloud-winged bird, known to travel even faster than a flying arrow, I wonder what tricks you will pull, he said to himself sinisterly. 4 months. I will wait for the day of your arrival. It appears that my plan will be a success. Who would dare obstruct my progress? If they obstruct my plans, I will kill them. If a god hinders me, that god will die. If a Buddha hinders me, then that Buddha will die. Ha 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 ha. Dr. Mo suddenly laughed wildly, his eyes filled with a crazed expression. You are too full of yourself. That little brat is brilliant and is definitely someone who will spare no expense to achieve his aims. Don't count your chickens before they hatch and carelessly overlook things, lest you suffer your downfall at the hands of this little brat. Suddenly, the voice of a youthful man rang inside Dr. Mo's mind. Dr. Mo's expression changed in an instant, as though it was covered by frost. He icily replied. Use Hitong, you better not intrude in my business. Do you think you are qualified to tell me what to do? If I can succeed, I naturally won't forget about my promises towards you. Instead, the question is whether you are scheming behind my back. Are you withholding some crucial parts of the cultivation art you imparted to me and hoping that some accident will befall me? Dr. Mo's voice was filled with suspicion as he replied. The youthful man's voice seemed somewhat terrified of Dr. Mo, and he hurriedly assured. How could there be any mistakes? Didn't you already test it on some animals? Other than the one that passed away due to its unfamiliarity with the cultivation art, didn't the rest survive? The failed experiments shouldn't hinder your plans, right? Humph. That better be the case. It's a pity that I can't cultivate. If that weren't the case, my chances of succeeding would be increased by a large degree. As Dr. Mo heard the explanation from that mysterious voice, the last shred of caution in his heart melted away. After finishing his sentence, that mysterious voice maintained its silence as though it was taught a lesson, leaving Dr. Mo to mumble crazily to himself. This caused the entire room to be filled with an eerie atmosphere. At this moment, Han Li was holed up in a nondescript cave. This cave was even more secretive and remote than the meeting place he found with Li Feiyu. The layout of the area revealed that the only path to this cave was obscured by 2 mountain peaks that formed the shape of a line. The mountain ravines were swamped with shrubs and plants on both sides of the path, making the path impossible to traverse. The only way to arrive at the cave was through a hidden rope that dangled from the top of one of the mountain peaks. Other than that rope, there were no other entryways. Thorny trees surrounded the area and occupied the majority of the area, only leaving a small piece of land where Hanli could cultivate. At the top of the mountain cave, there were some unknown vines weaved together into a natural canopy, so Hanli had no concerns that he would be accidentally discovered by random prying eyes. Hanli removed the items that he held on his body, placing them below an enormous mountain rock, and returned back to the center of this area. He closed his eyes, falling deep in thought. Suddenly, his eyes snapped open, revealing traces of determination in his eyes as he lightly said, "Let's start practicing from the soft bones art." And just like that, Hanli embarked on his path to cultivation. What he didn't realize was that not far from him was a yellow-colored bird perched onto a tree branch, constantly monitoring his movements. Because Hanli had no intentions of escaping, the yellow bird did not immediately rush to inform its owner. And within the mountain cave, a single glance could tell that there was no one else inside the cave. The only ones who were there were Hanli and that little yellow bird, which was preening its feathers as if it had forgotten its original mission. Suddenly, a gray-colored bird flew inside the canopy. It landed on top of a yellow pile of wood where it seemed it would rest before taking off again. In that instant when the yellow-colored bird saw a bird of another species appear before it, its expression turned somewhat human-like as it became filled with disdain. The little bird that just arrived stood on one leg as it contemplated its surroundings. When it discovered the yellow bird, it flexed its wings, wanting to fly over. Abruptly, something unexpected occurred. A yellow palm appeared out of nowhere, catching hold of the gray-colored bird in a single attempt. This sudden change caused it to be terrified. It struggled in vain with its life on the line. No amounts of efforts could allow it to regain its freedom. At this moment, the little bird understood that what it had mistaken for a pile of yellow wood was actually a yellow-robed youth. This yellow-robed youth had a dark complexion and extremely ordinary looks. Other than his clear eyes, he had no other attractive features. The youth smiled slightly, looking at the struggling bird in his hands. When it finally grew tired, he opened his palms as he stated gently, "You can go. Don't be so foolish next time. Look carefully before you attempt to rest." Once the bird regained its freedom, it no longer bothered with the yellow-clothed youth. It frantically flapped its wings and flew out of the cave opening. As his gaze followed the path of the flying bird, the youth stood there mutely. Only after a moment passed did he begin to mutter under his breath. "Seems like my breath control and concealing techniques are already somewhat proficient. Next, I must practice my assassination techniques." After speaking, Hanli walked towards a small wooden house which he had built, and on the way there, he involuntarily glanced at the yellow-colored bird. This bird's strange actions had caught his attention about half a month ago. This bird would always perch nearby, observing his actions, as if the bird had gained intelligence. When he first saw it, he was amazed and captivated by the intelligence of the yellow bird. He tried to capture it but was unsuccessful no matter what methods he used. This bird seemed to have no inclination to be fooled. It even stared at Hanli as if he were an idiot, causing Hanli to smile bitterly. Afterwards, in a fit of anger, he tried to use direct force, but before he even got near, the yellow bird would soar to the skies, out of his reach. Whenever Hanli left, it would return back to its original spot. Hanli had no other ideas and thus could only stare at it from his original position. On the surface of his mind, Hanli no longer concerned himself with the bird. In his heart, however, he had already deduced that the bird was here for a reason. Perhaps the bird was sent here by Dr. Mo to spy on his movements. Even so, Hanli had no cause for concern. As long as the one doing the monitoring was not Dr. Mo himself, how many details could the little bird reveal? And in addition, he was amazed by the intelligence that this little bird possessed and was thus unwilling to use poison to deal with it. At this moment, Dr. Mo was in a stone chamber, using the bones of wild beasts to form a strange array formation. As he arranged the formation, he was discussing matters with the mysterious voice from earlier, not knowing that Hanli had already discovered the method the doctor was using to spy on him. At this time, the Seven Mysteries sect was undergoing a major event. It turned out that the idol of the current generation of disciples, Senior Disciple Li, possessed a perception far beyond that of his peers. He quickly saw through two of the feral Wolfgang's spies and their plot to steal the names of the disciples that were undergoing adventures away from the mountain. With 10 fellow disciples, they captured them in one move. This was quite a meritorious deed. Several days later, sect leader Wang awarded Li Feiyu the position of protector in the presence of many disciples. This caused him to stride forward to the Seven Mysteries sect's mid-rankings, leading to a rise of great sensation. Li Feiyu's reputation had grown even greater. Hanli didn't know of this at all. He was currently sealed off in a wooden house in the mountain, undergoing special training. Aside from occasionally going to the kitchen to get some food, he did not have any contact with others. He naturally did not know that his close friend was currently held in such high regard. Summer passed, followed by autumn. Time passed quickly until the arranged date had finally arrived. In the ravine of the overgrown forest, there was a strange, incomparable silhouette midst the overgrowth of the dangerously sharp and thorny branches. None of the sharp branches were able to obstruct the floating, smoke-like figure. In the thorny undergrowth, he weaved between the thick net like a fleeing demon. In one moment, he appeared nearby, in the next, he was already a distance away. These motions were absolutely quiet, as if there were not a fleshly body but rather an incorporeal form. Finally, this silhouette stopped on top of a tree. Standing at its peak, he surveyed the surrounding distance. This was Hanli, with some success from his cultivation regime. Currently, the clothes on his body had turned to little more than worn, tattered rags, revealing his bare flesh. His hair was like a ruffled crow, while his face was a mixture of black and white. His original appearance couldn't be made out. What was most astonishing were the small exquisite iron bells, each hanging from his neck, waist, arms, thighs and ankles. Seeing these iron bells and then thinking about Hanli's ghost-like movements in the forest, it would be hard to differentiate Hanli's body technique from the movements of an actual demon. Motionless, he turned his head toward the direction of God Hand Valley. He muttered to himself, just in time. I had just become proficient in the shifting smoke steps on this final day. With this technique, I have a slightly greater assurance of self-preservation. Although the expression of his face couldn't be seen clearly, the joy in his eyes wasn't concealed at all. After several months of diligent research and training, Hanli wielded a number of formidable secret techniques. He held quite a bit of confidence in them. Although he wasn't convinced that they could withstand Dr. Mo's unfathomable skills, he held some confidence that he could defend himself. A light breeze came. Hanli felt a slight chill on his body. He lowered his head to look at his clothing. Thinking about his current appearance, he couldn't help but bitterly smile. Recalling his training with shifting smoke steps, he still had some lingering fear. In the forest undergrowth where he cultivated the technique, he had lived through a truly frightening experience. When he started training with this strange technique, he was covered all over with cuts and bruises from scraping against the unavoidable, stiff thorns. Fortunately, he possessed vitality-raising pellets. In addition to treating internal injuries, they unexpectedly had an amazing effect on external injuries. After eating one, not only did it staunch the wound, there wouldn't even be a scar by the next day. Hanli clicked his tongue in marvel. This medicine was incredibly more potent than common concoctions. The only thing that confused him was why the medicine was named Vitality-Raising Pellet. It seemed to him that the name Scars Away and Staunch Bleeding would be more appropriate. If the experts that created the Vitality-Raising Pellet knew what Hanli was thinking, they would have likely spit out blood from anger. This elaborate and elusive healing panacea had actually been compared to the golden wound medicine, a common Jiang Hu elixir, by Han Li, who thought that it was only relatively stronger. How could these experts not die from anger? However, because he had practiced in such a dangerous environment, Han Li was able to make the fullest of his potential. Within this short time, his shifting smoke steps had reached the level of proficiency where he could immediately put it to good use. In addition, Han Li's eternal spring arts had just recently and unexpectedly broken through to the 6th layer. This was the highest layer of the chant that Dr. Mo had given him. Were it not for the assistance of those tens of elixirs, even if he were to exert all of his strength, it would have been unlikely for him to achieve this level of success in this lifetime. After a few years of cultivation, Han Li had quite a bit of understanding and experience with the eternal spring arts. He felt that this level of success was very unusual. Regardless of the means by which he cultivated, the effectiveness and results were completely different from common martial arts. Initially, Han Li thought that the success rate of cultivating this particular martial art, as well as the speed of comprehension, depended on one's individual talent. One bestowed with good aptitude would naturally perform as expected, without any obstructions. Even if one had no external assistance, by means of hard work, he or she would be able to reach a high layer. But if one's aptitude was no good, once a certain layer was reached, he or she would be unable to advance a single step further without the assistance from elixirs. Han Li estimated that in a normal cultivator's lifetime, he or she would stop at that very point without the slightest advance. This idea was very much reflected upon himself. In the past, he managed to cultivate to the 3rd layer very smoothly, but at the 4th layer, he was met with incomparable difficulty and did not advance in the least. However, if one had elixirs, the impossible would become possible, and it would be possible for one to break through the limitations of their natural aptitudes and advance to another layer. With this in mind, it is obvious how greatly cultivation depended on the power of medicine. However, those like Han Li, who ate elixirs every day like snacks, were reckoned to be non-existent in the entire world. Therefore, it would be reasonable to say that the even more difficult 5th and 6th layer had been effortlessly cultivated by Han Li, who had not encountered the difficulty that he had faced from cultivating to the 4th layer. The cultivation of the 6th layer of the eternal spring arts, aside from making Han Li feel more vigorous than before, made his mind even sharper. For the time being, he hadn't discovered any other wonderful effects. What was strange was that ever since he cultivated this eternal spring arts, his spirit, mind, and 5 senses were somewhat strengthened with each increasing layer, but it had little effect on his body's health. He had no choice but to make his body sturdy and his footsteps light. In addition, his cultivation of the eternal spring arts had formed a new energy flow, which Han Li called pseudo-true qi. Although it moved through the channels of true qi, it did little more than make his sense of touch more sensitive. It did not have the same formidable might as true qi. Having trained this much, he was certain that the 6th layer wasn't the end of the chant. Perhaps it had the further wonderful effects that would be revealed in the later layers. Thinking of this, he helplessly shook his head and sighed. With regards to his current relationship to Dr. Mo, the final layers of cultivation was a matter he could only dream of. Halting his imagination, Han Li jumped off the tree, softly landing on the ground. Not a sound was produced. Then, with long strides, he walked to his residence. Tomorrow, he would meet with Dr. Mo, but before then, he had to make full use of his innate skills. His mind planned each step of his encounter with Dr. Mo in advance. He carefully pondered every finite possibility of the dangers that had yet to occur and formulated an optimal plan for responding to the threats that he simulated in his mind. The sun hung high up in the sky. Despite this time of year being the beginning of autumn, the heat from the sun was scorching hot. Dr. Mo was in his room, fidgeting. Although he was confident in his methods of dealing with Han Li, he could not be completely at ease. Suddenly, sound of footsteps could be heard, slowly approaching his residence. When he heard the sound of the familiar footsteps, Dr. Mo was filled with joy. He rushed hurriedly and opened the door. As expected, standing outside the door was his long-awaited target, Hanli. Watching Hanli slowly approach him, Dr. Mo fiercely suppressed the glee in his heart before allowing a trace of smile on his face. Not bad, you are indeed punctual. Seeing that you have made no attempts to escape, I'm truly happy. This means that you are intelligent. Let us enter the house before we have a good discussion. The expression on Dr. Mo's face was like that of a kindly elderly neighbor. The smile on his face was akin to a blooming flower. You can relax, I didn't set any traps in the house, Dr. Mo quickly explained to him, seeing the alertness in Hanli's eyes. Humph. Since I've dared to come, why would I be afraid to enter your residence? Hanli immediately replied, as if he couldn't stand the slightest provocation. After he replied, Hanli took a step to enter the residence. Dr. Mo immediately shifted his body to the side, allowing Hanli to enter. After Hanli entered, he extended his hands, attempting to close the door, but before he could do so, Hanli interjected without turning back his head. If you dare close the door, I will assume that you have some tricks up your sleeves. There's no way I would still discuss anything with you. After hearing Hanli's words, Dr. Mo panicked. However, he swiftly recovered and left the door open. Unsatisfied, he exclaimed. I truly want to have a discussion with you. I mean no harm towards you. Since you are not willing to let the door be closed, we will just leave it open then. After saying this, Dr. Mo reclined on his chair. The two of them silently stared at each other. They have not met for half a year, and thus, they were considering engaging each other carefully. In Hanli's eyes, Dr. Mo had clearly declined a lot. He looked even more aged and withered now, no different from a 70-year-old grandfather. Involuntarily, he murmured in his heart, could it be that what he said was true? All he wanted to do was to recover his vital energy. Was there truly no other sinister plan? Did I overthink things? As Hanli studied his surroundings, his pupils swiftly contracted. That muscularly built, mysterious figure was standing silently at one corner, like some sort of corpse. If Hanli had not meticulously scanned every corner, he would surely have missed him. After his prior inspection of Hanli, Dr. Mo was extremely satisfied with his condition. As such, he warmly stated, looking at the current you and comparing it to the person who had just entered the sect back when he was only 10 years old, you have already grown so much. The sudden shift in conversational topic and the change in atmosphere caught Hanli off guard, making him wary of Dr. Mo's intentions. However, in his heart, Hanli raised his alertness to its maximum level. This sly old fox, the salt he had eaten was much more compared to the rice Hanli had consumed. If Hanli was the slightest bit careless, he would undoubtedly fall into a trap. Old Mo, I will forever engrave your care towards me in my heart, never forgetting it. Whatever request you have, I will try to fulfill it. Hanli's expression warmed, as if he had turned back to the obedient disciple he had been ages ago. Excellent. Excellent. Your words prove that I have not wasted my time and efforts on you. Come, let me see how much your progress with the eternal spring arts has improved. At that moment, Dr. Mo seemed to assume the role of the kindly teacher. Standing up, he directly attempted to take Hanli's pulse. Sly old fox, how cunning and thick-skinned. Hanli cursed in his heart as he swiftly sidestepped, avoiding Dr. Mo's hand. Old Mo, don't be in such a hurry, I can truthfully tell you that my eternal spring arts have reached the 4th layer. However, I want you to give me the antidote to the insect corpse pill first. After I'm cured, I will let you inspect my progress. Hanli smiled as he used a sincere tone while talking to Dr. Mo. Oh my mind must have become muddled. My memory is no longer as good as before. Initially, I intended to give you the antidote the moment you stepped in. Shock adorned his features as Dr. Mo seemed to have recalled something. He withdrew a silver flask from inside his robes and took out a black-colored, ordinary-looking pill, which he tossed towards Hanli. Hanli acted clumsily and barely managed to catch the pill that was tossed over to him. Bringing it to his nose, he sniffed it. Waves of spiciness were released from the pill. He inclined his head to look at Dr. Mo, only to find Dr. Mo smiling at him. He hesitated, suspecting the authenticity of this antidote. Yet, there was no way for him to avoid ingesting it because the insect corpse pill would soon activate. If he did not ingest the antidote now, it was equivalent to committing suicide. Hanli believed that Dr. Mo would continue acting cautiously and refrain from giving Hanli a fake antidote. Hanli's expression turned heavy as he chose to swallow the antidote, waiting for its medicinal effect to take place. At this moment, Dr. Mo was extremely relaxed. He began to chat nonchalantly with Hanli, as if he had forgotten what his real purpose was. Not long after, Hanli could feel a surging wave of immense pain originating from his stomach, but the pain swiftly subsided. He quickly began to inspect his own body and realized that the insect corpse pill had disappeared without a trace. Joy filled his heart, and his face broke out with traces of a smile. Naturally, the changes had not escaped from Dr. Mo's notice. He waited for Hanli, who was completing his inspection. With a huge smile on his face, he said, "Ah, Hanli, when I gave you the insect corpse pill to ingest, it was merely to give you extra motivation. If not for that, I think you might not have broken through to the fourth layers of the eternal spring arts so easily. Thank you for Dr. Mo's kind intentions. However, I hope that such intentions will not be needed in the future." After recovering, Hanli's state of mind improved, and he began to slightly believe Dr. Mo's sincerity. He was not as directly opposed to Dr. Mo as before. "Now, will you allow this old man to take your pulse?" Dr. Mo's words caused Hanli's expression to grow unsightly. To think that Dr. Mo would still request examine his cultivation. Who knew whether Dr. Mo would decide to grab this opportunity to further control and harm him? Hanli lowered his head as he pondered. It seemed that there was no way he could avoid Dr. Mo's inspection. Dr. Mo had actually given him the antidote without hesitation, showing his clear sincerity. If Hanli still tried to beat around the bush, Dr. Mo's suspicion would be raised, causing him to think that Hanli had not yet broken through to the fourth layer of the eternal spring arts and instead was lying to him with false words. If that were the case, things would likely take a turn for the worst, causing many unexpected occurrences beyond his control. Nevertheless, Hanli had long anticipated this moment and made his preparations. Even if Dr. Mo had malicious intentions towards him after taking his pulse, Hanli still had several ways to guarantee that he would be able to escape. As he thought of this, Hanli raised his head. He glanced at Dr. Mo with both eyes before saying, "Old Mo, seeing how willingly you presented me the antidote, I will trust you one last time. I hope you will not cause me to be disappointed." After that, he extended his right wrist towards Dr. Mo while silently observing the other party's reactions. If anything seemed out of place, he would instantly retract his arm. Regretfully, Dr. Mo maintained the false smile on his face. He could not detect anything at all. The only change in expression he made was a slight twitch of his eyebrow after Hanli agreed. Swiftly, he regained his original expression. It appeared that Dr. Mo had long expected Hanli to agree to his request. Dr. Mo made no reply as he silently extended his left hand and placed it onto Hanli's wrist. The smile on his face was slowly reined in, causing Dr. Mo to exhibit an extremely serious expression, as if he were carrying out an incomparably holy act. Hanli secretly caused his body to manifest the chi of the fourth layer. When he saw Dr. Mo's expression, he raised his caution and alertness to the highest stage while his left hand slowly dipped towards his waist, where he had hidden a recently manufactured short sword. Slowly, Extreme joy broke out on Dr. Mo's face. From taking Han Li's pulse, he had discovered that there were unceasing waves of a mystical energy circulating within Han Li's body, its intensity far exceeding his expectations. Despite him being a cunning old fox with vast worldly experiences, he could not help but tremble slightly upon seeing that his only hope for salvation lying before him actually had a chance of succeeding. Excitement shone on his face. His smile was extremely radiant and couldn't be compared to the fake smile he had on his face earlier. This is wonderful. You really broke through to the fourth layer of the Eternal Spring Arts. Ha ha. This is too amazing. Ha ha ha. Dr. Mo began to laugh uproariously, not bothering to maintain his previous facade in front of Han Li. The sound of his laughter reverberated through the whole house, and yet, his hands remained tightly clamped onto Han Li's wrist, as if he had no intentions of letting go. Old Mo, what is the meaning of this? Let go of me. Han Li's expression turned chilly. He had expected something of this nature to occur and had attempted to retract his hand immediately after Dr. Mo's inspection, but Dr. Mo had given him no such chance. Let go of you. Sure. Dr. Mo ceased his laughter. However, expression on his face changed. He suddenly unleashed a roar, "Tai!" Han Li felt his ears rumble as the world turned dark before his eyes. His body lost its balance, and he collapsed onto the floor. His left hand, which had been grasping onto the short sword's hilt, fell limply to the ground. F***ck. Even though his mind was clear, Han Li's body refused to listen to his commands. Despite all of his precautions, he still suffered from Dr. Mo's sudden sneak attack, causing him to unable to react in time. Brat, you are still a greenhorn. No matter what tricks you have up your sleeves, you have no way to execute them now. Everything was going as he had predicted. Dr. Mo couldn't help but grin and appear smug after achieving his objective. Come over here. Dr. Mo's left hand pulled Han Li over, dragging Han Li's body to his feet. Lowering his own body, Dr. Mo extended the index finger of his right hand and jabbed at the paralyzing acupoints located in front of Han Li's chest region. Peng. A sound rang out. Dr. Mo's finger met resistance as if it had attempted to pierce into a metal plate. His fingers trembled from the waves of pain that assailed him. For some reason, his acupoint stimulating technique had failed. What is happening? He became shocked as his heart shuddered involuntarily. Could it be that he wore a layer of metal armor underneath his shirt? Dr. Mo wondered, surprised by the resistance. His gaze involuntarily searched Han Li's body. However, seeing how thin Han Li's clothes were, he shook his head and immediately discarded the idea. In the moment during which Dr. Mo was distracted, Han Li regained control over his body. His recovery abilities were far beyond what Dr. Mo had imagined. Han Li's true cultivation was at the 6th layer of the Eternal Spring Arts. He had truly not wasted his time and efforts in cultivating. His recovery rate was extraordinary, far surpassing even his own expectations. At this moment, Dr. Mo decisively discarded his train of thought, causing all of his confusion and suspicion to dissipate. He began to think of another method to control Han Li, but in that instance, he discovered that Han Li's wrist, which was currently locked firmly in his grasp, suddenly became extremely smooth, as if it were soaked with oil. There was no way for him to forcefully exert his strength and lock onto Han Li's wrist. Disbelief clouded his features. He tried to force more strength into his grip, but Han Li's hand was akin to an earthworm in the soil, easily slipping out of his fingers and leaving Dr. Mo stunned. Disregarding Dr. Mo's shock, after Han Li was free, he quickly rolled his body away on the floor towards the far end of the room. He only dared to stand up once he was at a far distance away from Dr. Mo. The current Han Li had no expression on his face. Both of his eyes stared coldly at Dr. Mo. There was no need for Dr. Mo to say any more nonsense. Although Han Li did not know the reason behind Dr. Mo's actions, he could tell that Dr. Mo most assuredly had bad intentions. It seemed like what Dr. Mo had said earlier was all a bunch of nonsense, not worth an ounce of belief. For the sake of his family as well as his own safety, Hanli drew the short sword, which had been hidden near his waist. This short sword was only a foot long, yet incomparably sharp. Its blade gleamed with a green light. This was a first-rate short sword indeed. Today, either you or me will perish. Only one of us can walk out of this place alive, Hanli coldly stated, baring his teeth in anger as he glared at Dr. Mo. Dr. Mo looked slightly astounded at his left hand, then returned his gaze to Hanli. He said disdainfully, "Interesting. It seems like you really didn't idle around for a year, even unexpectedly training in such a strange skill. But you did really think that you could become my opponent by relying on a few cheap tricks. It seems I have not fought for a long period of time. Personally, taking part to exercise my limbs is not a bad idea. I will let you make the first move." Hanli did not pay attention to Dr. Mo's insult. He had already decided to gain the initiative by striking first. As the saying goes, be the first to act and take any opportunities. The short sword in Hanli's left hand was brought to the front of his body, attracting Dr. Mo's gaze. But from his inner right cuff, he quietly slipped down a white paper bag, dropping it into his palm. After that, he waved his hand to scatter a wide stretch of fine white powder from the white paper bag. In the blink of an eye, it turned into a thick white smoke that enveloped Hanli entirely, making his figure appear unclear and indistinct. Moreover, the white smoke quickly diffused throughout the entire house and made the whole room into a vast expanse of whiteness. Even if one were to hold his or her hand out, he or she wouldn't be able to see even his or her fingers. Hanli had strangely disappeared amidst the smoke. Dr. Mo wrinkled his brows. Hanli's move was beyond his expectations, but in his heart, he disregarded it. Because of his experience against this kind of third-rate trick, he had many ways to counter it. It was only because he was afraid that the smoke was poisoned that he held his breath. With his deep profound skill, not breathing for 45 to 75 minutes was no problem at all. Humph. What insignificant talent. And you still dare to show off in front of me. Dr. Mo snorted coldly. Suddenly, his right hand slapped an empty spot within the smoke. The smoke stirred as if it were being hit by a large club, and it immediately surged outwards, creating a large distinct hole. Though he could not see Hanli's silhouette, Dr. Mo did not stop. Striking everywhere from all sides, he released more than 10 strikes in a row, making the smoke in the house completely disperse out from the front door. The room returned back to normal, apart from the missing Hanli. Strange. This brat truly has some ability. Even when I am in front of him, he can make himself disappear as if he had ceased to exist. Dr. Mo was astonished, but he did not panic in the slightest. He had kept a constant watch of the door and its vicinity. Even if a flea flew past, it would not escape his detection. He carefully ran his eyes across the entire house. The surrounding bookshelves, the desk and chair were untouched, everything appeared to be the same. There was nothing out of the ordinary. Thus, how could such a big fellow like Hanli disappear completely in a small place like this? Dr. Mo's expression changed. There were slight misgivings in his heart, but he boldly coughed a few times. He then unsteadily walked to the place where Hanli disappeared from, wanting to take a closer look at what actually happened. When he was a few feet away from the area where Hanli disappeared, he stopped and squinted both eyes. He faintly felt a discernible killing intent direct at him from nearby, getting ready to make a move. Dr. Mo's eyes radiated energy that was used to carefully sweep the room. But even so, he was unable to discover anything abnormal. He began to worry that there was no one nearby. Could it be that Hanli decided to go up to heaven or down to hell? To go up to heaven or down to hell, Dr. Mo was completely lost in his thoughts and was thinking as if he had realized something critical. While he was pondering over it, there was a sudden dang sound above his head. Not good. Dr. Mo suddenly realized that Han Li had concealed himself in the beam of the roof. He was unable to look up in time. With a shout, Dr. Mo raised his hand upwards and struck his palm severely to stun his opponent in one move. Following the powerful strike, an explosion rumbled out, but the only sound that was audible was sharp and clear dang. Dr. Mo was somewhat puzzled and hurriedly lifted his head to inspect the beam. He couldn't help but to stare foolishly at the empty space above, where not even a ghost of a reflection could be seen. There was only a small black metal bell hanging from the beam of the roof, jingling incessantly in the wake of his strike. This was the source of the dang sound. Not even Han Li's shadow was there. During the time in which Dr. Mo was looking upwards, a wisp of cold light, with the abruptness of a thunderbolt, pierced violently towards Dr. Mo's lower abdomen. Its speed was incredibly fast, comparable to lightning. It was only when the light was about to touch his garments that Dr. Mo noticed it. Dr. Mo turned pale with fright. In a great rush, he reacted instinctively and twisted his body. It was as if his body did not have a spine as he bent backwards, bending into the shape of an arch. This dangerous short sword blow just barely scratched his belly, making a small cut, nearly slashing open his stomach and eviscerating him. After experiencing that attack, Dr. Mo did not dare to relax. As if the sole of his feet had contained springs, he jumped backwards several meters without changing his posture. Only after retreating did he dare to rise and look alarmingly yet furiously at the direction where the short sword's flashing light had emerged from. Only to see that the ground where Dr. Mo had stood just moments ago began to slowly swell. Unexpectedly, the swell became bigger and taller until Han Li finally emerged. He had used a combination of soft bones art, breath control art, and false hiding technique. At that moment, Han Li's clothes were the same color as the yellow ground. His left hand carried the same short sword that had nearly hit Dr. Mo, and his eyes expressed an annoyed look. It seemed Han Li felt that it was a pity that he missed his target just now. Startled by the previous slash, Dr. Mo's heart was beating madly from fear of that short sword. He was not an inexperienced recruit who had never faced danger, but even so, there were only a handful of instances during which he faced a near-death experience. What made this experience even more frightening was that it was caused by Han Li, whom Dr. Mo had always looked down upon with disdain. He took a deep breath, his expression finally becoming serene, and said in a dry and rough voice, "It seems that I have underestimated you, my dear young disciple. Your display of skill was not bad. You are truly worthy of me taking you seriously." After saying this sentence, Dr. Mo slowly raised both hands to his eye level and gazed tenderly at his hands without saying a single word. His gaze was similar to passionately looking at a lover, forgetting completely about Han Li. Han Li raised both his eyebrows and sneered. He grasped his short sword tightly in one hand and slowly approached Dr. Mo in small, measured steps. Demonic silver hands. These three words rang out slowly from Dr. Mo's mouth as if they had drifted over from a faraway place. They possessed unfathomable demonic energy, causing Han Li to involuntarily freeze, halting his steps. Just as Dr. Mo's voice faded, a surge of immense killing intent seemed to explosively gush forth from Dr. Mo's body. The intensity of this killing intent was comparable to that of howling winds and torrential rains, increasingly getting stronger from all four directions, covering the entire residence. As Han Li strode forward, he clashed directly with the sudden surge of killing intent, and was involuntarily forced back a few steps before he could stable his body, standing upright. Han Li's expression drastically changed as his heart rapidly sank. He knew that Dr. Mo had finally stopped underestimating him and thus decided to use an ultimate technique to deal with him. It seemed like his encounter with Han Li's short sword had truly angered Dr. Mo. He. Little brat, to think you could witness my ultimate technique, demonic silver hands. Your level of good fortune is normally accumulated over 3 lifetimes. Dr. Mo's ear-shattering roar still buzzed incessantly into Han Li's ear. Luckily for Han Li, Dr. Mo did not infuse the technique from earlier with his qi. It seemed that Dr. Mo disliked using a method that failed already to deal with him again, causing Han Li to be slightly less worried. However, after hearing Dr. Mo boast about his ultimate technique, the demonic silver hands, Han Li could not help but stare at the hands of his opponent. After he looked, Han Li's face froze as he went slack-jawed, dumbstruck by what he was seeing. Dr. Mo's hands, originally as thin as tree branches, were swollen to more than twice their original size. What was even more terrifying was that his yellow and pallid skin had actually undergone a physical change and took on a silvery hue. Under the bright rays of the sun, it reflected a cold golden light, appearing to be indestructible and completely constructed from silver. This is Dr. Mo's true strength. After looking at Dr. Mo's hands, Han Li's heart sank even further. He clutched his short sword's hilt with a single hand while rivulets of sweat involuntarily appeared on his palms, causing his grip to be wet and slippery. His combat experience was severely limited, so a single new skill displayed by his opponent was sufficient enough to cause Han Li to worry, turning the atmosphere heavy. On the surface, however, Han Li appeared unaffected. With a calm countenance that did not reveal the slightest bit of worry, he seemed to look down upon the ultimate technique Dr. Mo was displaying. Dr. Mo was ultimately unsatisfied. He began to see Han Li in a whole new light, but he still felt that displaying his supreme technique in front of a young teenager was truly overestimating his opponent, akin to using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. As such, he initially expected Han Li to be frightened and beg him for mercy. Only then could Dr. Mo soothe his pride. "Do you know that I extremely hate the expression on your face? A brat who is still stinking of his mother's milk can act so bold, as if he has everything under his control," Dr. Mo coldly stated, making no attempt to mask his disdain and hatred towards Han Li. "Oh, is that so? Letting old Mo feel disgusted is my honor. I think that in the future, I should further nurture my talent in this area," Han Li sarcastically replied, hoping that his sarcasm would cause his opponent to slip up and give him an opportunity. However, Han Li's obvious intentions were seen through. Dr. Mo stopped speaking and slammed his palms together, causing a peng sound to ring out, similar to the sound of grinding metal. His intent was to cause fear in the heart of his opponent. Dr. Mo's figure shook as he leapt in the air and maneuvered his inflated silver palms. Like a raging wind and as robust as Mount Tai, he rushed towards Han Li. Dr. Mo did not intend to waste any more time to capture Han Li. He would unleash his ultimate technique through a single strike. With a heavy expression, Han Li focused his full attention on Dr. Mo's approach. After Dr. Mo had leapt into the air, Han Li raised his hands and aimed at the weak point of any individual, his neck. Dr. Mo slightly gawked when he saw how audacious Han Li was. Han Li actually intended to face his hard technique head-on. Dr. Mo couldn't help but feel joy in his heart as he laughed manically. "Go to hell." He directed a silvery hand to catch Han Li's short sword and aimed his other hand at Han Li's shoulder blade. Both hands smashed through the air with frightening speed. However, although the palm strike towards Han Li's shoulder blade looked tyrannical and terrifying, Dr. Mo only used half of his strength in that strike, which totally contrasted with his shout earlier. He was worried that he would critically injure Han Li and ultimately be unable to use him in his plans. Han Li naturally did not know of the truth of this matter, and as such, he treated the attack very seriously. There was no way he would use his own body to test the toughness of his opponent's silvery hands. Instead, he lightly shook his wrist, causing the short sword to slash horizontally instead of drawing arcs in the air. He intended to use this move to protect the upper half of his body. Dr. Mo snorted, but the trajectory of his hands remained unchanged, still relentlessly pursuing the short sword without the intent to evade. Dang! A crisp sound rang out as Han Li's short sword slashed into the silvery palm, causing a few sparks to fly. However, the short sword did not manage to leave even a scratch on Dr. Mo's palm. Dr. Mo made use of this opportunity. Flipping his palm, he extended a finger and flicked it against Han Li's short sword without giving Han Li the chance to retract his weapon. As Han Li felt an explosive tremor, part of his short sword's blade broke and flew far away, burying itself in the wall. The other silvery hand formed a claw that arched towards Han Li's shoulder blade, hoping to seal Han Li's movements and catch him alive. Although situation was rapidly taking a turn for the worst, Han Li showed no signs of panic. He slightly shifted his shoulders and sprinted forward, his body transforming into a column of smoke in front of Dr. Mo's eyes. Seeing such a ghostly body movement technique, Dr. Mo felt shock in his heart. However, he continued his attack, positioning both his hands in front of him like a screen to contain and block the smoke. He had no intention of letting Han Li escape. The smoke was truly abnormal. It hesitated for a moment before darting slightly in all four directions as if it were contemplating which direction to escape to. It moved in a strange angle and evaded the screen. In the blink of an eye, the smoke sped towards the leftmost corner of Dr. Mo's residence before stopping and transforming back into Han Li. Dr. Mo landed gently on the spot where Han Li had originally stood. Without pause, he turned around to face Han Li. The proud look on his face was gone. Instead, all that remained in Dr. Mo's eyes was shock. At this time, Han Li wasn't doing very well either. He kept inhaling deeply while sweat collected on his forehead. Although his face was pale, his cheeks were flushed with a strange red color. These were all signs that pointed towards one fact: the evasion technique that Han Li pulled to save his life had consumed most of his energy. It was highly probable that he would not be able to pull off the same trick the next time. Taking a deep breath, Han Li tried to relax his body in order to relieve his muscle strains from using the shifting smoke steps. All he could do now was to make the most of any time to recover so that he would have a better chance of winning in the next exchange. Han Li glanced down again at his left hand, which was still slightly shaking. There was no way he could use his numb left hand to wield his short sword. It seemed that all the hard work he spent training himself to wield the short sword with his left hand was all for naught. He could only count on his right hand for the rest of the fight. When he thought about it, he smiled bitterly to himself. He lost most of his energy and couldn't use the marvelous shifting smoking steps anymore. Even worse, he could only use one hand to fight. Since the situation couldn't get any worse, he decided to use his trump card. Han Li looked at the sun outside the house, estimated its position, and thought that it was a good time to execute his next technique. He peeked again at the short sword stuck in the wall, and knew that it was impossible for him to get back his weapon. Dr. Mo wouldn't let him just go and take it back. Han Li mumbled for a little bit and pulled out another weapon from his bag. This one was also a half-foot short sword with a scabbard, but since it was too short, it was more fitting to call it a dagger instead of a sword. When pulled out of its scabbard, it looked like a normal dagger with an abnormally thick blade that had been polished and sharpened. Han Li threw the scabbard aside and switched the dagger to his right hand. He extended his right arm, pointing the dagger at Dr. Mo in an offensive stance. Dr. Mo saw what Han Li was doing, but he didn't hurry to attack. He put both of his hands on his back and spoke softly with a kind face. Han Li, you surprised me when you repeatedly dodged my attacks, but do you think your luck will last forever? The movement technique you used just now was quite good, but it has its own limitations. Judging by your physical strength, it's impossible for you to pull it off again. Just surrender like you should have in the beginning. You should be able to see by now that I have no intention to seriously hurt you. Just listen to me, maybe it won't be as bad as you thought. Dr. Mo's change of attitude made Han Li have goosebumps all over his body. He had changed from a cold-hearted and unfeeling figure to a kind and gentle teacher. Now, he was using meaningful and heartfelt words to try to convince Han Li to surrender. Han Li didn't know what to say. Dr. Mo actually thought Han Li would be that stupid and fall for this obvious lie. However, his words caused Hanli to gain some confidence. Dr. Mo wouldn't have used this childish trick to fool Hanli if he wasn't growing desperate. Hanli thought seriously for a while. He then signed and shook his head. Without a word, he waved his dagger at Dr. Mo and showed him his refusal. Dr. Mo's veins on his forehead suddenly bulged. Seeing Hanli ignore his words and use his weapon to provoke him, Dr. Mo couldn't suppress his anger any longer. "You don't know what's good for you." He quickly took a big step forward and ferociously said, "So close yet so far apart." Suddenly, Dr. Mo's body nimbly moved to a spot only a few steps from Hanli, as if he were capable of shrinking space, a feat that evoked extreme fear in those who had witnessed this technique before. Hanli, too, had a look of extreme shock displayed on his face. He swiftly retreated 2 steps backwards, increasing the distance between him and Dr. Mo, before brandishing his dagger horizontally in front of his body. The blade weaved a dance of cold light in the air, blocking Dr. Mo's path forward as if Hanli had forgotten the previous suffering he had faced after clashing directly with Dr. Mo. Dr. Mo coldly laughed. Of course he would not remind his opponent. He separated his palms and attacked Hanli from 2 directions, completely disregarding the dagger's strange dance. As the 2 silvery hands approached the rays of light emitted from the dagger's dance, a bright laughter floated out, akin to what a hunter would do as he watches his prey step into a trap that was prepared beforehand. It was a laugh filled with immense satisfaction. The laughter dulled Dr. Mo's reactions and made his heart slightly tremble. As he slowed down his attacks, he heard a cold voice saying, "You have completely fallen for my trap. Look at the dagger in my hand." After hearing this, Dr. Mo involuntarily shifted his gaze over, only to see that the dagger had stopped its dance. In place of it, Hanli made a strange stance. He arched the upper half of his body and moved the sword down to his waist. The lower half of his body was stretched tightly like a knocked bowstring. His overall posture was similar to an arrow that was about to be shot from a bow. Other than emitting rays of green light, there wasn't anything else strange about the dagger in Hanli's hand. This caused Dr. Mo to be astonished. Could it be that Hanli adopted such a weird posture just to distract him? Thinking of this, glee blossomed in his heart. Dr. Mo wanted to sneer at Hanli, only to find Hanli rushing forward like an arrow of incomparable sharpness. Shooting forward like a bullet, Hanli's advance caused Dr. Mo's expression to change. Hurriedly, Dr. Mo once again joined his separated palms together, intending to use his palms to suppress the edge of his opponent's blade. Strangely, the dagger only slightly wavered and somehow transformed into more than 10 daggers that waved around in the air before piercing towards Dr. Mo from different directions. Dr. Mo loudly snorted. In his heart, his evaluation of Hanli dropped by a few degrees. In front of an expert such as him, Hanli actually chose to use such an ordinary technique. Wasn't that equivalent to seeking death? Dr. Mo could tell with a single glance where the body of the true dagger was. As such, he squinted his eyes, targeting the position of the true blade. He increased his attack speed with the intention to crush the real dagger into pieces, causing Hanli to lose a weapon. Once both parties were about to make contact, Hanli slightly moved the edge of his dagger. The blade's angle had only shifted slightly, but in Dr. Mo's eyes, his whole world had turned into chaos due to the seemingly minuscule but earth-shaking change. The small light reflected on the dagger's edge suddenly gave rise to a dozen extremely dazzling white balls of light. The radiance was incomparably intense, and Dr. Mo could not stop it from shining directly into his eyes. Not good. He secretly cursed in his heart as he hastily retreated backwards, immediately shutting his eyes. But by then, it was too late. The white light had already entered his eyes and prevented him from attacking. In that instant, Dr. Mo felt his eyes heat up, and his eyeballs began to ache incessantly. Tears dripped down from his eyes without restraint, and he had no time to wipe them away. He endured the discomfort with much difficulty and strained to open his eyes, but all he could see was a vast expanse of whiteness. Even an object's silhouette appeared like the layers of a mirage, fuzzy and indistinct. He instantly felt angry and frightened. Because of his own carelessness, he regretfully fell for his opponent's crafty trick once again. However, Dr. Mo had traveled the country for a long time and thus had plenty of experience in handling various kinds of dangerous situations. He continuously retreated several steps backwards to try and gain some distance away from Hanli and buy himself some time to recover. Simultaneously, he withdrew his palms to the front of his body and waved them relentlessly. Relying on the invulnerable demonic silver hands, he protected the crucial areas of his upper body. He had already decided that before his eyes recovered, he would not take the initiative to attack. Any offensive attack would have to wait until he could see clearly again before making a move. Dr. Mo was aware that he was yet again caught within the brat's trap. Currently, Dr. Mo's contempt for Hanli had disappeared from his heart. The level of danger in his struggle against Hanli was not inferior to the life-and-death battles against formidable opponents from his earlier years. Even though he could not see Hanli's movements, Dr. Mo twitched his ears and listened with rapt attention, trying to use his sense of hearing to determine Hanli's next move. Suddenly, Dr. Mo vaguely saw a shadow flash by. Shortly after, there was a sharp noise and a surge of cold wind coming from his front. Dr. Mo did not panic at Hanli's attempt to assassinate him. Instead, he was delighted. Hanli's strategy was somewhat naive. If Hanli had silently hid at one side to mount a sneak attack, Dr. Mo would have truly been worried. However, there was nothing to fear from a bold frontal attack. He had already trained his hearing to the point of perception, able to distinguish between the sound of wind, a thrust of a dagger, and an attack from an embroidery needle. He was able to hear perfectly. Dr. Mo heard the noise clearly, but his hand deliberately slowed down to make a small opening in front of him. Sure enough, the surprise attack immediately changed direction, deviating from its neutral path and making a beeline for his throat. Dr. Mo grinned hideously. His right hand, which had been waiting the whole time, suddenly made a move. He quickly grasped firmly onto the edge of the blade as he did not fear the sharp edge of the dagger at all. Hanli was aware of the turn of events and violently exerted some force to pull the dagger back a few times. But in the grasp of the demonic silver hands, the dagger did not budge at all, making Hanli's attempts a waste of effort. Dr. Mo felt a little proud of himself, but he did not dare to be careless for a moment because he was afraid that Hanli would realize this chance and release his grip on the dagger to run away. With disregard for his ability to see, Dr. Mo abruptly executed a move using 100% of his power with one hand. He pulled the dagger to one side, planning to pull Hanli firmly away from his front and personally hold him down. Instead, Dr. Mo felt that his hand was as light as a feather, as if there was nothing in his palm. He was greatly startled. He had definitely grasped the edge of the blade, so how could his hand be so light all of a sudden? Even if Hanli decided to abandon the dagger and let go of it, it shouldn't have caused Dr. Mo's hands to lighten this much. Before Dr. Mo could figure out what was going on, he felt the sharp sensation of tearing air a few inches in front of his throat. It seemed that there was a sharp and thin object stabbing at him at an extraordinary speed. Before it even arrived, the blast of air had already made his neck sting slightly. Dr. Mo did not have enough time to think about it. His body acted on reflex and maneuvered evasively. At once, his head dropped to one side, and he leaned over with all his might. His neck was bent in an unfathomable angle in an attempt to avoid a fatal attack. Dr. Mo's many years of bitter training in profound skills had finally displayed their usefulness. At this moment, Dr. Mo felt something cool, a sharp object, brush against his neck. It barely grazed his skin and did not result in further injury. After dodging this attack, Dr. Mo feared that Hanli still had some moves in reserve. Without thinking, he actually copied one of Hanli's previous escape tricks. He dropped his whole body to the floor and rolled away. Only after rolling a great distance from Hanli did he dare to rise and stand. He hastily used 2 fingers to put pressure on the blood vessels in his neck to stop the bleeding. At this moment, some fear arose in him. A moment ago, he felt that he could not have avoided the attack, but he did not expect his body's instincts to be brought into full throttle and actually manage to escape death by random chance. He had been thinking hard up to this point, but eventually Dr. Mo could not help but raise his head to glance at Hanli. At this time, he discovered that he could see the objects within the room with clarity. He was unaware at which point in time his vision returned back to normal. Dr. Mo could only see Hanli glaring at him with dissatisfaction, obviously discontent with Dr. Mo's continuous evasion of his blade. Hanli carried in his hand a sharp, inch-long weapon. From its shape, it resembled an odd awl, but its handle was the original dagger hilt. The weapon as a whole looked somewhat grotesque. The surface even had some blood stains on it. This was indeed the strange weapon that had injured Dr. Mo. Dr. Mo turned gloomy, his eyes filled with fury. He kept having narrow encounters that threatened to cost him his life. Dr. Mo was about to lose his patience and about to burst with anger, but he noticed that his right hand was still holding onto something. He looked down and saw an immobile blade. He lightly lifted it up to get a closer look. Suddenly, he realized that this blade was hollow. The space within the blade was similar to the shape of the sharp awl. This blade was merely a cover used to conceal the awl from his vision. Because of this discovery, the rage that filled him was suddenly extinguished thoroughly. Dr. Mo finally figured out why Hanli had been determined to keep the door open the moment he entered the room. Hanli's request foreshadowed his use of the sun's glare. Dr. Mo's opponent was of such a young age. How could he be this thorough? This meticulously calculated sinister chain of events made this old and experienced figure of Jiang Hu unable to fight back. Hanli's profound schemes did not match his age and experience. Could it truly be that this person was truly a natural genius, perhaps even a reincarnated prodigy? He pondered deeply. The more he thought about it, the more his fear grew. A cold sweat covered Dr. Mo from head to toe. Enduring this frustration, Dr. Mo grew far more wary of Hanli. He cautiously and solemnly faced the youngster. For a short while, he did not dare to act again. Hanli also did not know why Dr. Mo was just staring at him without the slightest intention to attack. For a short while, both sides had silently decided to cease hostilities. They gazed at each other in anxiety. After a moment passed within this awkward atmosphere, Hanli suddenly started speaking. His sentence would leave Dr. Mo dumbstruck and distracted. "Elder Mo, why don't we make peace? Or how about I surrender? What do you think?" Saying this, Hanli swung his arms. He straightforwardly threw down his weapons and gazed at Dr. Mo with a smile, exposing rows of pure white teeth. Just like that, he donned the appearance of a simple and honest youngster from the countryside. Surrender. Dr. Mo originally believed that his ears had gone bad. However, he immediately reacted. Looking at Hanli's discarded awls, he did not have slightest degree of trust, so he fiercely asked, "What's your plan? Don't think that I would trust your false words. You want to surrender? You could have done that from the start. There was no need to wait until after we became irreconcilable adversaries. What else is up your sleeve?" Hanli looked at Dr. Mo with a smile and did not speak. Instead, he seemed to tacitly agree to his criticisms. These two had once more sunk into confrontation. After a short while, Dr. Mo seemed to think of an extremely funny matter. He unexpectedly lifted his body, put both hands on his abdomen and laughed at the top of his lungs. The laughter was unrestrained, and tears flowed out from the corners of his eyes. "Ha ha! Ha! Ha ha! Truly! This is truly interesting. I had actually forgotten such an important aspect. I had actually truly been the target of your traps," said Dr. Mo in an ambiguous manner in between his disjointed laughter. Hanli wrinkled his brow, but soon after, he smoothed it out. As he glanced outside the window, the corners of his mouth formed a strong smile, and he calmly said, "Elder Mo, don't you feel that this delay has gone on long enough? It's about time to finish this." Dr. Mo grew slightly distracted and stopped his hearty laughter. He slowly straightened himself and stiffened his face. With an expressionless face, he stared at Hanli for a long time before coldly replying, "I, too, feel that it is time to conclude this." The two suddenly calculated their respective chances of succeeding. In that split second, they both thought of ways to force their opponent to reveal their cards. After a moment of awkward silence, Hanli slowly opened his mouth. He held no other thoughts other than the confidence of being able to force Dr. Mo to concede. "Elder Mo, did you know that your life is already in my hands?" Hanli's words could leave a person utterly astonished. "My life is already in your hands." Dr. Mo sneered, his face had an expression of distrust. "Don't you think that wound of yours is a bit peculiar?" "Nonsense. I took a careful look at it." "Your dagger doesn't have." Dr. Mo refused to believe his words, but halfway through his own reply, his expression greatly changed. He recalled that what had injured him wasn't that dagger but rather that hidden awl. "It seems I don't need to say any more. Elder Mo already understands my meaning." Hanli looked at Dr. Mo with a snicker. "Even if I were poisoned, you forget. Your medicinal techniques were all taught by me." "There is no poison I cannot remove," Dr. Mo calmly said. His face immediately went back to normal. He. "I forgot to say. The poison that I applied on my blade was aromatic coiling silk." "Aromatic coiling silk?" Dr. Mo let out a soft cry of surprise. This had greatly exceeded his expectations. "Correct, Elder Mo surely knows how difficult it is to deal with this poison." "Nonsense, how could you possibly concoct such a poison?" "I didn't divulge even a segment of its formula." Dr. Mo's appearance was still strong, and he seemed to be unconvinced of Hanli's words. However, from the strange sensation he felt from the wound, his heart was already certain that Hanli somehow managed to concoct the poison. Seeing that Dr. Mo was still not admitting defeat, Hanli sighed. He would have to explain further. "You have long forgotten that I was given complete access to your library. This recipe was slipped into an obscure medical book, but had I not been attentive, I fear that I would have missed it." Dr. Mo recalled this fact. Back when he had originally obtained this recipe, he casually slipped a detailed copy of the medicinal formula into a random book because he was afraid he would forget the convoluted procedure, which required too many ingredients. Later, he completely forgot about this piece of paper because he had far too many affairs to handle. He hadn't expected this to benefit Hanli and cause him such a huge problem. "We should take a seat and have a proper discussion. Let us shake hands and make peace," Hanli confidently said. "Humph." Dr. Mo did not take notice of Hanli, his brain was hard at work remembering the effects of the aromatic coiling silk. Aromatic coiling silk. This name did not sound dreadful in the slightest. In passing thoughts, people even found that it sounded elegant and romantic. However, its poisonous strength was like the yearning of an infatuated woman, unbearable and bone-deep.